Welcome back to the Remedify coaching program. You know we always love diving deep into the stuff you send our way, and today, well, we've got a presentation with a title that definitely doesn't pull any punches. I do not believe the Bible knew P-Doc.
Yeah, that'll get your attention, right?
It sure does. But then there's the subtitle, and it kind of flips the script a bit. Before one rejects the Bible, he or she should know what its central message is. Like, hold on, let's talk about this before you just toss it aside. And that's exactly what we're going to do today. We're going to unpack those core arguments, dig into the evidence it presents, all that good stuff, so you, the learner, can really grasp those central ideas. Clear, engaging, hitting the highlights without getting lost in the weeds. That's the goal.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
A really important one, too, because, well, this presentation, it's not just a casual, here's what I think kind of thing. It's a direct challenge to anyone who's maybe on the verge of dismissing the Bible entirely. It's almost saying, hey, have you really considered this? Do you even know what you're rejecting? That's a pretty powerful starting point for a conversation.
It definitely sets the stage, right? And then, boom, slide 2 hits you with this big question. What do you think that message is? No beating around the bush there. And then it lays down its central argument. The main character, the heart of the Bible, is Jesus Christ. But it doesn't stop there. It goes on to make this really interesting comparison. You know, how we accept all these other figures from ancient history, sometimes based on, well, what seems like even less evidence. And then it gets even more thought-provoking. It suggests that maybe, just maybe, some skepticism toward Jesus comes from, well, kind of wanting those claims about him to not be true. What's your take on that?
I think what's so fascinating is that it zeroes in on Jesus right off the bat.
Yeah.
It's like, love it or hate it, you can't deny that he's at the very center of the Bible's story. Now, that comparison to other historical figures, Caesar, Alexander the Great, folks like that, that really makes you think about how we approach historical evidence in general. We know about a lot of those ancient figures from sources that were written way later, sometimes centuries after they lived. But we generally accept they existed. We believe the main points of their stories. So why this extra level of scrutiny when it comes to Jesus? And that idea about skepticism maybe coming from a desire for the claims to be false, that's a real gut check. It makes us examine our own biases. Like, are we filtering the information through what we want to be true rather than what the evidence might be pointing to?
Definitely makes you stop and think for a second. Before we go any further, the presentation lays out its structure. It says it's going to focus on 4 key points to help us understand the Bible's credibility. Seems like a good roadmap for our deep dive today.
Absolutely. These 4 points, they act like pillars supporting the overall argument. It lets us break down this big, complex topic into more manageable chunks, and that's super helpful, especially for you, the learner, trying to follow along and really absorb all this information.
So let's tackle that first point head on. Slide 4. New Testament writers got their facts straight. Right away, it emphasizes how careful and accurate these writers supposedly were. Their goal, it says, was to provide hard evidence, not just tell stories. And they even back it up with some specific examples, like Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 3. Luke actually talks about how he investigated everything thoroughly, how he interviewed eyewitnesses who lived with Jesus. And then there's John chapter 19, verse 35. John flat out says his gospel is based on what he saw firsthand. If that's true, if these texts are rooted in eyewitness accounts, doesn't that change how we have to view them?
I mean, if we take those claims at face value, it completely transforms how we approach these writings. Look, eyewitness accounts, they're not perfect. Human memory is a tricky thing. But they do carry a certain weight, especially when the writer is upfront about wanting to give an accurate, historically grounded account. Think about Luke's intro. He talks about carefully investigating everything from the beginning, wanting to give this guy Theophilus an orderly account. That sounds like someone going for historical accuracy, right? And then John just straight up saying, hey, I saw this with my own eyes. It reinforces that idea that these aren't just stories passed down through generations, getting more and more distorted along the way. They're anchored in what people actually experienced.
It's like getting a first-hand report from the scene, rather than a rumor that's gone through 10 people already, right? And to drive that point home, slide 5 brings in the Apostle Paul. It points out that in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 1 through 7, Paul actually names specific people who saw Jesus after he rose from the dead. He's basically saying, go ask them, they were there. That's a pretty bold move, especially in a time without social media and instant fact-checking.
Totally. By naming names, Paul's making his claims verifiable. He's so confident in what he's saying that he's basically daring people to go check his sources. And remember, these were people living at the time, people who could back up or refute his claims. It adds a whole other layer of realness to the story. It's not just Paul theorizing about stuff. It's grounded in what he and others claim to have actually witnessed.
Then there's this super interesting story about Sir William Ramsay, this historian who started out seriously doubting Luke's accuracy. But as he did his own archaeological digs and research, he actually ended up convinced. That's a huge turnaround for someone coming at it purely from a historical perspective, not a faith-based one.
That's a classic example of how evidence from outside the Bible can really challenge and change our understanding of it. The fact that Ramsay started out skeptical gives his eventual conclusions even more weight. It shows that Luke's writings weren't just religious pronouncements. There were historical details in there that stood up to serious scrutiny. It's a good reminder that faith and historical investigation, they don't always have to be at odds.
And speaking of historical context, slide 5 also throws out this idea that historical fiction, like we know it today, was pretty much unheard of in the ancient world. If that's the case, how does that affect how we view the New Testament?
That's a huge point. We're so used to historical novels and movies, fictional stories set in real historical periods. But if that wasn't really a thing back then, it makes it way less likely that the Gospels were just made-up stories disguised as historical accounts. The writers were operating in a totally different cultural environment where, generally speaking, historical writing meant trying to record what actually happened, even if different people interpreted or emphasized those events in different ways.
So you're saying it was less about making stuff up and more about recording what they believed to be true, even if they might have spun it a certain way?
Exactly. It was a different set of rules for what counted as historical back then.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. So moving on, slide 6 drops this big question. Who could have invented Jesus? And it even throws in this quote from Strauss. It would take a Jesus to invent a Jesus. Now that's a statement, right? It kind of gets at the heart of how unique and complex Jesus was as a figure. What are your thoughts on that?
That quote, it's really trying to highlight how difficult it would be to just come up with someone like Jesus out of thin air, especially in the context of first-century Judaism. His teachings, they challenged the status quo. His actions were unconventional. And the impact he had, well, it's hard to overstate how profoundly he influenced his followers and the course of history. It's like, how could someone just invent a figure that impactful, that multi-layered, from scratch? The coherence of his character, the complexity of his teachings, it raises serious questions about the whole made-up theory.
It's like if you were going to fabricate a character, wouldn't you make them a bit simpler, a bit more straightforward, less likely to rock the boat?
It makes you wonder. And that brings us to point number 2, which tackles this whole idea of exaggeration head-on. Slide 7 is titled, "The Disciples Did Not Exaggerate About Jesus." This section directly addresses the theory that maybe Jesus' followers just kind of hyped him up over time, like how folklore often builds up around admired figures. And it makes this crucial distinction. The disciples were Jewish. Their entire worldview was built on believing in one God and one God only. The idea of turning a human being into a god, well, that would have been unthinkable to them.
So their cultural background really plays a huge role here, right?
Absolutely. For devout Jews at that time, saying a person was equal to God, that wasn't just unlikely, it was blasphemy. Their whole religious tradition was centered on the absolute oneness of God, his complete separation from humanity. To suddenly accept one of their own as divine, that would require them to totally upend their understanding of God, everything they'd ever believed in.
It's like turning their entire belief system upside down, right? And the presentation makes that even clearer by contrasting it with the Greeks. On slide 8, it points out that for the Greeks, turning humans into gods was no big deal. They did it all the time with guys like Hercules. This comparison really highlights how different those two mindsets were.
Absolutely. The Greek religious landscape was way more fluid. They were used to adding human-like deities to their pantheon. It was just part of their culture. But the disciples, coming from that strict Jewish background where that was a huge no-no, they would face massive internal and external resistance to saying Jesus was God. It wasn't a familiar concept for them at all.
And to really drive that point home, slide 8 reminds us that for thousands of years, Jewish people would rather die than bow down to any god besides their own. And then it specifically mentions Paul, that he was a Pharisee. Pharisees were like the super strict traditional branch of Judaism. So how does his background factor into all this?
Paul's story as a Pharisee is super telling. They were the most zealous about following Jewish law and tradition. So for someone like him to not only accept Jesus as the Messiah, which was already a huge claim, but then to go even further and proclaim him as divine, something that would have been outrageous in his original belief system. It suggests something truly massive happened.
Yeah.
Like, he either had this unbelievably powerful, undeniable experience, or he was convinced by what he saw as irrefutable evidence. There's no way he just casually changed his mind about something this fundamental.
It's like he went from being the president of the One God Only fan club to leading the Jesus is God movement.
Very much.
So all that leads us to slide 9, and it's titled simply The Evidence. The presentation's argument here is that only incredibly compelling evidence, something truly undeniable about Jesus himself, could have persuaded those Jewish disciples with their strict monotheistic beliefs to acknowledge him as God. It wasn't just a gradual shift or a story getting embellished over time. Something had to happen that made them rethink their entire worldview.
That's the crux of it. It wasn't just a cultural shift or folklore building up. There had to be something that felt radical, something that forced a complete paradigm shift. And a lot of people point to the resurrection, the event Paul emphasizes with all those eyewitnesses he names, as the key turning point.
It makes you wonder, what did they experience that was so powerful, so convincing, that it made them change their entire understanding of God? Okay, now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the texts themselves. Slide 10 brings up the third key point. The record has been preserved accurately. It starts by explaining that back in the day, books were handwritten, copied over and over again on parchment or papyrus. And then it makes this pretty bold claim. The textual evidence for the New Testament is actually better than for any other ancient book, not just in the number of copies we have, but also how close some of those copies are to the originals. That's a big deal when it comes to trusting what we're reading, right?
Huge deal. When you have that much manuscript evidence, literally thousands of ancient copies and pieces of copies, it allows for a much more thorough textual criticism. Think of textual criticism like historical detective work. Scholars compare all these different versions, looking for variations, inconsistencies, and trying to piece together what the original text most likely said. And the fact that we have so many manuscripts, some dating back pretty close to when the originals were written, gives us a lot more confidence that what we have today is accurate compared to, say, some ancient Greek play where we only have a handful of copies from centuries later.
So more copies, closer to the source, means less room for error, less chance of things getting lost in translation over time.
Exactly. It's all about getting as close to the original source as possible.
Makes sense. So to help us understand that timeline, slide 11 gets into the beats, giving us some key markers. It says the church was founded around AD 30. Then the Gospels were written relatively early. Mark in the early to mid-60s AD, Matthew and Luke in the late 60s or early 70s AD, and John maybe a bit later, and Paul's letters, those come even earlier, some written in the 50s AD. And the presentation emphasizes that this early dating is crucial because it means those accounts were written while people who actually saw those events were still alive.
That's a huge point for historical accuracy. It means the writers were either eyewitnesses themselves or they could talk to people who were. That makes it much more likely that they're writing based on actual memories, not just legends or stories that got passed down and embellished over generations. It's like the closer you are to an event, the less likely it is that the details get distorted. Plus, it also means that people who were around back then, even those who were skeptical, they could challenge or confirm those accounts.
So it wasn't just happening in a vacuum. People could have called them out if they were making stuff up.
Right, there was accountability.
And finally, we get to the fourth and final point on slide 12. There's good support outside the Bible. It highlights Josephus, a Jewish historian who wrote around AD 90. He recorded some pretty important facts about Jesus' life. Having this independent source, someone who wasn't a Christian, backing up key details, that seems like strong evidence, right?
It adds a lot of weight to the story. Josephus, he was writing from a completely different perspective, and yet he confirms Jesus existed. He mentions things like the crucifixion under Pontius Pilate, the rise of Jesus' followers. It shows that Jesus wasn't just a character in a religious text. He was a real person who left a mark on history, someone even non-Christians knew about and wrote about.
It's like having an independent journalist corroborating a news story. It adds credibility.
Exactly. And there's another interesting reference on that slide, a guy named Phallus. He wasn't a Christian either, and he wrote around AD 52, mentioning this darkness that covered the earth during the crucifixion, an event also described in the Gospels. The presentation even says this darkness was seen in Rome, and people were trying to figure out what caused it. That's a super early reference from outside the Bible to a pretty unusual event.
Talk about a strange coincidence, right? It's like if someone was going to make up a story, wouldn't they choose something a bit less, well, out there?
It's definitely an interesting piece of the puzzle. Even though we mostly know about Thallus's writing from later authors quoting him, it still suggests that something unusual happened around the time of the crucifixion, something that even non-Christians noticed and tried to explain. It aligns with the gospel accounts in a way that's hard to ignore.
It's like a little historical footnote that adds another layer to the whole story.
Yeah, exactly.
So we've covered a lot of ground here. Slide 13 gives us a helpful summary. It boils those 4 key points down to this. Strong evidence from the New Testament writers themselves, no exaggeration by the disciples because of their deeply held belief in one God, a reliable historical record that's been preserved accurately, and supporting evidence from sources outside the Bible. These are presented as the pillars holding up the Bible's claims about Jesus.
It's like they're saying, look, here are 4 separate lines of evidence, and they all point in the same direction.
Right, it's not just relying on one source or one type of argument.
Exactly.
And then slide 14 takes it all and wraps it up with a pretty definitive statement. It says that these facts of history create what it calls an unshakable foundation for the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's basically saying the historical case for these core Christian beliefs is solid, it's well supported by the evidence.
That's the conclusion they draw from everything they've presented. It's like they built their case, laid out their evidence, and now they're saying, okay, this is what we can confidently say based on what we know.
It's interesting how it shifts from presenting the evidence to making that definitive statement. It's like, we've shown you the facts, now here's what we believe those facts mean.
It's definitely a shift in tone from exploration to assertion.
And then slide 15 takes a bit of a turn. It hits us with this very direct question. What will you do with Jesus? It presents this stark choice, like accept him as Lord and Savior or reject him and face the consequences. It's not about historical evidence anymore. It's about personal choice, about how you're going to respond to all this information.
This is where the presentation moves from the historical realm into the personal, the spiritual. It's like, okay, we've looked at the evidence. Now what are you going to do with it? How will this impact your life, your beliefs, your choices?
It's like that moment in a courtroom drama where the lawyer turns to the jury and says, now it's up to you to decide.
Right. It's putting the ball in your court.
And to give some context for that decision, slide 16 offers some key Bible passages. There's John chapter 3, verses 16 and 17, talking about God's love and sending Jesus to save the world, not condemn it. Then Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 through 10, focusing on salvation being a free gift, not something you earn. And finally, Romans chapter 10, verses 9 through 14, about confessing Jesus as Lord and believing in his resurrection to be saved. These verses add that theological layer to the historical claims, providing a framework for understanding who Jesus is and why he matters.
They're like the theological core, the heart of what Christians believe about Jesus. They explain why he came, how God's love works, and how people can connect with God through faith. It's taking the historical groundwork and building this whole theological structure on top of it.
So we've really gone deep here today. We've explored this presentation, I Do Not Believe the Bible New Pidok, looking at its arguments for the Bible's historical reliability, focusing especially on Jesus. We've talked about eyewitness accounts, evidence from outside the Bible, the cultural context of the writers, and the reasons to believe these texts have been preserved accurately. It's definitely a lot to process.
It's challenging us to really think critically about the Bible, to engage with it on both a historical and a personal level.
Absolutely. And we encourage you, the learner, to keep digging, keep asking questions, maybe even check out some of those historical sources for yourself. If you're looking for more resources to help you on this journey, make sure to visit those websites listed in the presentation. https://www.pnmoneymaking.com, https://www.pnmoneymaking.com, https://www.kkhealthconsulting.com, and https://kk2020.store. They've got a ton of great information there. Thanks for joining us today on the Remedify Coaching Program podcast.